a couple that had been married for 50 years. And one day they were sitting, reflecting, and the wife said, "You know, things have really changed. You used to sit so close to me." Well, the man, he thought for a minute, and he said, "Well, I can remedy that." So he moved next to her on the couch. She said, "Well, you used to hold me tight. How's that?" he asked as he gave her a great big hug. She kind of whispered to him and said, "Do you remember when you used to nuzzle my neck and nibble on my earlobes?" At that, he jumped up and left the room. "Where are you going?" she asked. "Oh, I'll be right back," he called. "I went to get my teeth." We're into the Ruth, the 3rd chapter, and the 8th and 9th verse says this. Around midnight, Boaz suddenly woke up and turned over, and he was surprised to find a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he demanded. "I am your servant Ruth," she replied. "Spread the corner of your covering over me, for you are my family redeemer." Now, things are really starting to heat up for Ruth. And then depending on how you read this 9th verse in this 3rd chapter, they could be getting a lot hotter. But as you recall, things started out kind of looking fairly bleak. Naomi and her husband and their 2 sons had moved to Moab because there was a famine around their hometown of Bethlehem. The sons they had married Moabite women. Well, Naomi's husband died, and then it wasn't too much longer, her 2 sons died as well. This devastated Naomi, and she was convinced that God had done this to her, and that she didn't have a future. So she might as well just return to her hometown in Bethlehem. Besides, rumor on the street was that the famine in Bethlehem was over. She encourages her daughter-in-laws to return to their original family so they can get married again. One does, but not Ruth, because she's devoted to her mother-in-law. So leaving behind her language, her native land, her culture, her people, she went to Bethlehem with Naomi. So now we've got 2 poor women trying to eke out an existence in Bethlehem. And in that era, if you didn't have a man, you didn't have much hope, because it was pretty much a male-dominated world. Men, they owned the property, they earned the living. And if you were a single woman, not under the cover of some man, whether it was an uncle, a father, a brother, a husband, you were pretty stuck. And this appeared to be the case of Naomi and her daughter-in-law Ruth. Although, they still could do the things that poor people do to survive. So Ruth had went out into the fields to glean. Well, as it turned out, she ended up gleaning in the field of a middle-aged, balding, overweight guy named Boaz. And Boaz was very nice to Ruth, making it easy for her to glean. He even provided and gave her lunch and some extra grain for her to take home to Naomi. Ruth goes home to Naomi with her booty, and Naomi says, "Wow, this guy would make a great husband for you. Hey, he's even a member of my late husband's extended family." That's where we ended up and left off last week. Today, chapter 3 opens up with Naomi breaking her silence. She said, one day Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, should I not try to find a home for you where you can be well provided for?" Is not Boaz, with whom servant girls you have been, a kinsman of ours? Basically, Naomi is telling Ruth to quit delaying claim to what is rightfully hers. It is a time for her to move on. But I wonder what was keeping Ruth from claiming that redemption. Maybe she didn't feel worthy enough. Maybe she felt like she just wasn't good enough. Maybe she felt her being this Moabite woman would get in the way. Maybe she felt and feared rejection. Maybe she's, like me, just a procrastinator. Maybe she was stuck in the past and not in the present. Well, for whatever reason, Ruth was failing to claim what was rightfully hers. But the only way this could happen was for Ruth to choose it. So the ball was quickly in her court. For many in our world, for whatever reason, we too fail to claim our redemption. We live out our lives never claiming the hope of the future. You see, according to their ancient custom, members of the family had an option. Actually, it was an obligation to marry the widow of someone in the clan. However, there had some specific guidelines on who was first in line to do this. So as we continue in our third chapter story, it says, tonight he will be winnowing in the barley on the threshing floor. Wash and perfume yourself and put on your best clothes. And then go down to the threshing floor. But don't let him know you are there until he's finished eating and drinking. And when he lies down, note the place where he's lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do. Wow, Naomi was very specific about what to do. I think maybe Naomi knew that Ruth was a foreigner in this strange land, and she had no clue about what the customs were. So Naomi not only pointed Boaz out as her personal redeemer, she briefed her on how to specifically do what she needed to do. Now notice that Naomi tells Ruth that Boaz is on the threshing floor. And that's significant. Because we think of the threshing floor as a place of work. And that's true it was. But when the people went to the threshing floor, it was also a time of festivities and thanking God for the abundant harvest. Because they would sing praises and thank God for the abundant harvest. Naomi knew that Boaz was probably going to be in the best mood he would be in out on the threshing floor. And so it would be a good time for Ruth to go over there and claim him as her redeemer. So Ruth does exactly what Naomi said. She goes to the threshing floor where Boaz has been working and apparently eating dinner too. Now here's kind of a note about the threshing floor. We don't need to think of the threshing floor as being inside Charlie's barn or anything like that. Customarily, the threshing floor was located on the top of a hill so it could catch the wind that was blowing. The clay soil was packed hard and packed smooth, and it usually was created in some kind of a circular shape, and it was created with rocks that were placed around it. Sheaves of grain were spread on the floor and trampled by oxen drawing a sled. And people with pitchforks would throw the grain up into the air so that the chaff would blow away and the grain would come down on the threshing floor. And when the wind died down, they'd have this great feast. And at this season of the year, all the families would come and camp around, like a picnic, around the threshing floor, which meant there were lots of people present. But after the feast was over, the men, they would sleep around the grain. Since the threshing floor was circular, typically what they would do is they put their head towards the grain and their feet would stick out like spokes. And they slept that way to protect the grain from the thieves who might want to break in and take easy pickings and steal it. So, Ruth waits in the wings until Boaz has eaten and had plenty to drink. And it got dark. And he was having to get up to go work early in the morning. There wasn't nothing good on TV anyway, so he goes to lie down, to sleep. Now, think of Ruth. Can you imagine how nervous she must have been with those what-if questions? What if I'm rejected? What if I'm humiliated? What if I can't even find Boaz amongst all the men? What if someone catches me? How am I going to explain it? What if? What if? But even with those questions, though, what we find out is she obeys Naomi's instructions. So as soon as he's snoring, Ruth sneaks in, pulls the blanket off of Boaz's feet, exposing them to the cool night air, and she lies down next to his feet. I'm guessing around midnight, Boaz realizes his toes are cold. So he wakes up, only to discover there's someone else in the room besides him. And not only is there someone in the room, it's a woman. And they're beside his feet. And he's a bit startled. He didn't know if it was a boogie woman or not. And that's where we get back to verse 9 that we started with. Who are you? He demanded. And of course, Ruth replies, I'm your servant. Spread the corner of your covering over me, for you are my family redeemer. Now, a kinsman redeemer was a relative who functioned on behalf of another person in his property within the family ties and the family circle, especially in times of crisis. He redeemed the property by purchasing what was lost and returning it to the one who was forced to sell. And he could redeem people. That is, a relative who had been forced to sell himself into slavery. He can redeem blood by avenging the death of a relative who had been murdered. Boaz could also fulfill the marriage that's recorded in Deuteronomy that provided that a childless widow could marry an available brother of her deceased husband to raise children in her deceased husband's name. But if there was no brother available, the next closest kin would do, and they could marry her. Naomi had once suggested, if you remember in the first chapter, that it would be impossible for her daughter-in-laws to wait around until she bore more sons to grow up and marry them. So what we do is we find Boaz is eligible in two accounts. Not only could he serve as the redeemer of the family, but he could also marry Ruth and raise up the children in her deceased family's name, so that name wouldn't get lost forever. But it seems Boaz's hands are tied in the matter of marrying Ruth, because what you find in that custom is it wasn't up to him. He could not claim her for her wife. It had to be Ruth's move. So Ruth says to the startled Boaz, I'm here, take me to be your wife, spread the corner of your covering over me. Now, we can read that several ways. She could be inviting him to receive her into his bed, which is really all it would take back in that culture to consummate a marriage. She could have married him right then and there. But there's more to it. Some of the translations render that verse, spread your covers or your cloak over me. And even the more literal translations, Ruth is saying, spread your wings over me. Those were the same words that in the second chapter last week, we found that Boaz said to Ruth, may the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, reward you fully. Scholars think Ruth is asking Boaz to protect her in the same way that God has given her refuge. Boaz, you're a family redeemer, so redeem me. Take me under your protective wings. Now Boaz, he's absolutely overjoyed, because his hands were tied in the matter. It wasn't up to him to pursue, but all of a sudden she got to come as interest to him, because she initiated it. She didn't go after the younger and wealthier men. She chose an older man named Boaz. Boaz, though, had apparently done his homework, because he's aware of another relative of Ruth who was a much closer relationship than he was. But he says, you see, there's this teeny tiny bit of a problem. I'm not really the first in line to redeem you. There's another relative that is closer. But I tell you what, let me see if I can work that out. He would have to settle the issue right away. He was going to give the other man the opportunity to redeem Ruth before himself. He wanted to do it the right way. Boaz didn't want anybody to know that Ruth had been on the threshing floor either. Nothing bad had happened that was improper. But you know what? Gossipers, they're not careful about facts when they're talking. So Boaz gives Ruth 6 measures of grain for the road. Don't know how much that is, but apparently it's quite a bit. He didn't want Ruth to go home empty-handed to her ambitious and spiritually sensitive mother-in-law. Lord knows he was certainly grateful for her good advice. And lastly, Naomi finds out and encourages Ruth to wait patiently for Boaz to work things out. She felt confident that he wouldn't rest until he got the matter settled. So what lessons do we learn from this chapter as we finish up the 3rd chapter? Well, the first one is God never inspires hope without also expecting actions. Have you ever had a burden laid on your heart? Have you ever been moved to tears over the suffering of another person? Have you ever had compassion for a needy person? Has the urge to make things right between you and another been haunting to you? Have you had a conversation with someone who you knew didn't have the faith in God and you wanted to talk to them about Jesus, but you just didn't know how or was afraid to? There is a solution to each one of these and many more that I didn't mention. That may mean we have to pick up the phone and make a phone call that we've dreaded to make. We may need to knock on a family member's door to ask for forgiveness. We may need to repent our sins and call on God's mercy to restore fellowship with them. We may need to write a nice, long, thought-out letter to someone who needs to hear that really somebody does care for them. Have you ever had a God-given hope placed in your heart and you didn't act on it? I know I have. And the second thing is we must claim our kinsman redeemer. There's no way around it. Boaz, as a kinsman redeemer to Ruth, is an illustration of how Jesus is our kinsman redeemer. He's related to us by blood, able to pay the price, and he's willing to redeem us. Boaz met the qualifications as a kinsman redeemer for Ruth, but she needed to go to the threshing floor to claim him. That was her choice, her prerogative. Similarly, Jesus meets all the qualifications to be our kinsman redeemer. He paid the price for our redemption. But we have choice, because we need to go and claim him as our redeemer. And third, there comes a time when all we can do is wait on God. When Ruth came back the next morning to tell Naomi about everything that happened, Naomi gave some advice that we as Christians hate to hear when we're anxious to get something done. She said, "Wait, my daughter, until you know how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest until he has settled it today." You know, this is sometimes the most difficult part of faith. When no more action can be taken and nothing remains but patiently waiting for God to work out his will. And it's at these moments when doubts can arise and our anxiety level just goes skyrocketing through the roof. Such is life, that all the details don't fall perfectly in place, do they? Because let's think about it. How comforting it would have been for Boaz to be the very next kinman eligible to be Ruth's kinsman redeemer. Could have been resolved right then and there, but it wasn't to be. And this should be a reminder to us that God may inspire hope in our hearts and then expect us to act on it. But at the end of the day, after we've done all we can, ultimately we must wait on God to accomplish what his purpose to do. Do we want our church to grow? So we went out and invited others to come, but we need to wait on God and leave the results to him. If we do have visitors come, do we want them to return, so we shake their hands and we get to know their names and we wish them well and we thank them for coming and we invite them to come again? But then we have to wait on God and leave the results to him. How about your kids and grandkids? You want them to love Jesus. So you love them with your heart, you pray for them, you share the gospel when opportunities arrive, but then we have to wait on God and leave the results for him. Maybe you're anxious about a business deal and you've done what you can. You've committed it to prayer. But then you've got to wait on God to leave the results in his hands. As farmers, we know that. Planting. And then after you've planted and done what you can do and watered it, ultimately we have to wait on God. But there are advantages to waiting on God and leaving the results to him. First, it eases us from guilt, because ultimately the final part of it's not up to us. It also helps us to appreciate God's answer, because we recognize that His will has been done when we've waited and seen the results. It teaches us also not to be so anxious about tomorrow. And it frees us to bless others as we recognize God is leading them elsewhere. So this third chapter of Ruth teaches us that God never inspires hope without also expecting action. That we must claim our kinsman redeemer. And there comes a time when all we can do is wait